everyone. Welcome to our new episode. Today we have with us Professor Susan Jones. She is an Emeritus Professor at St. Hilda's College, University of Oxford. She's in the English faculty, and her research focuses on 19th, 20th, and 21st century literature with emphasis on dance and drama as it relates to literature. So, from what I can tell from your research, you're very interested in these topics and these time periods, dance and drama being these emphases. And I know a lot of grad students find it difficult to pinpoint their research on something or someone. So I was wondering what you think of that process of choosing what or who to study. How do you approach pinning down what or who resonates with you, and what led you to your own research?
Well, I think it's probably easiest for me to start with the last question because it became an obvious research question for me because I used to be a dancer. I was with the Scottish Ballet for 15 years as a soloist there in Glasgow. And I really brought my experience to thinking about how does dance figure in English literature, because I was studying modernism. I wrote a book on Joseph Conrad, and I was starting to think about the amount of movement there is in Conrad's novels, in many modernist, proto-modernist and modernist novels, how there's a kind of focus on the corporeality of bodies and the gestures and meanings of gestures within modernist fiction. So in Joseph Conrad, for example, there are all these image schema metaphors where you have thinking about, the anchor being pulled to or the tide going out, that kind of interest in verbal present participles with an added directional preposition. So I always felt like there was a body there in the text. And I particularly found this with people like Virginia Woolf's writing, and many European novelists like Franz Kafka and other people, anyone almost associated with modernism or modernisms, as we say nowadays, try to get away from the monolithic term. But I agree, it is very difficult nowadays to find the topic. And I think the most important thing to bear in mind is a research question. What is it that you want to ask? If you're a graduate student and you have a vague interest in modernism, what is it about modernism that you want to ask? Does it, and in my case, it was about the way in which modernism was used in that term in that kind of umbrella of modernisms.
Definitely. So kind of thinking backwards almost, trying to answer
Yeah.
your own question.
Yeah, I'm trying to answer my own question because what happened was that I stopped dancing, had an accident, and it led to having to give up eventually, and then I thought, what on earth am I going to do? So I had never I'd never done it, senior school exams, A levels or anything like that in Britain. And I'd always wanted, at the back of my mind, to go to university. I mean, hubris, I thought, I can just go to university. I didn't realize I'd have to train first. So I did actually do 3 A levels and then the Oxford entrance exam, and got in to do an undergraduate degree in English literature. And then I just stayed on, and I got interested in Conrad's works because I was particularly fascinated by the fact that everybody said, well, there aren't any women in Conrad. So I thought, why not? And then I started to look and discover that there were actually quite a lot. So, that the gender of modernism really interested me. And of course, that comes up with dance. And then later, after I published that book, I thought, this is crazy that I'm not doing anything about, the career I've already had. You know, I've been dancing for years, and you know, why not think about it in relation to the area of English literature that I was interested in? So I started that way.
Yeah, almost connecting your own interests with your academic interests. I love that.
Yes, I mean, I don't think that's a bad thing for
Yeah.
graduate students. I mean, I don't know there. I'm probably giving all the wrong advice to
No,
grads,
not
but
at all.
I
Not at all.
do I do feel that if the impetus for the research question comes from your interest, it's bound to you know, have grip, and it'll work. Yeah.
Definitely. Definitely. And so on the subject of dance, you've written extensively on this amazing art form, particularly dance, movement, physicality, and literature. And just list some of your publications here to show everyone listening the actual breadth of this kind of research endeavor of yours. We have Dance, Modernism, and the Female Critic, in the New Age, Rhythm and the Outlook, Shakespeare, Modernism and Dance, choreographic re-embodiment between text and dance, physical and narrative movement in Heart of Darkness, T.S. Eliot and dance, female choreographers, and modernism and dance, Apolline or Dionysiac. And these are just a few that I'm listing. There are many more that I could keep going. And so can you can you tell us just a little about how you approach bridging what many would say or what many would see as a largely intellectual art form like literature, and a largely physical art form like dance? How do you approach bridging that gap between the corporeality of the body and the intellectuality of the mind? What is that process like for you, kind of working with these two kind of different art forms?
Right, that is a really interesting question, because although it's absolutely obvious to a grad student, you know, coming from the outside, I think what I try to think about in my own process is that there isn't so much of a gap as one imagines. That's why I found the modernist period, you know, the late 19th, early 20th century period, so stimulating for this particular endeavor, because you find that so many writers are actually thinking and talking about the non-intellectual, the non-linguistic. They themselves are trying to bridge this gap. They feel they're missing out on something. I think Virginia Woolf is particularly a good example of a writer who thinks about, you know, the processes of actually the body being in the text. So what I have tried to do is to really try and move away from these kind of reductive polarities of intellectual and corporeal, you know, the mind-body divide that everybody blames Descartes for, but it's not really his fault.
Definitely.
And think about how these two different processes are one. So for example, or I should say that we should think in more holistic terms than in reductive terms. So for example, I'm very keen on looking at practice as knowledge, and that's taken up by a lot of dance scholars nowadays, to looking at the idea that the body contains its own knowledge, its own intellectual knowledge, you know, partly through training, partly through existence of being, of walking along, you know, you know how to do it. Those kind of neuroscientific
Mhm.
impulses that are moving from the brain to the muscles and so on. So, so if you start thinking from a slightly different perspective and not worry so much about, you know, is it, you know, dance is not intellectual. Well, actually, dance is very intellectual in many ways. It depends how you define intellectual, of course. Do you see what I mean? There's practice of the body, and also there is thinking about how the body responds to intellectual problems. So there's that other side of the equation. Okay.
Definitely, yeah. So it's kind of like in the modernist age of literature, or in general, you have these scholars trying to eradicate almost the emphasis on or the hyper focus on language. So we have these writers trying to break down language or deconstruct language. So in a way, language is maybe becoming more corporeal. And with dance,
Exactly.
dance tells a story. Dance tells people's inner thoughts, and the way the body moves sometimes, as you're saying, is very intellectual and learned. And so in that way, the corporeal aspect is actually becoming very intellectual. So there's almost like an exchange going on. Is that what you're kind of getting at?
That's exactly what I'm trying to say. What I've always been interested in is the reciprocal relationship
Yes,
between dance and literature, that it's not just one way. And of course, if you look back to Baroque dance, or say look back to the 17th century, think about how codified ballet is, or danse d'école, how mimetic it often is. The Sun King presenting himself, Louis XIV, as the Sun King. There's this interest in the aesthetics of dance as an intellectual pursuit. And, Louis XIV, for example, got all his soldiers to do ballet in peacetime to keep the soldiers fit. So there's that militaristic element about the beginnings of danse d'école, the corps de ballet and the army corps. You can think of these metaphors that run across
definitely, definitely.
dance and other forms of life. Yeah. And
Even
dance,
yeah, even
dance
the
is
Nutcracker.
interesting because sorry?
Even the Nutcracker. I'm just thinking
Even the
about,
Nutcracker.
you know,
Let's think about the Nutcracker. What would
yeah,
you
it
say?
tells such a story. It tells such a. It's almost like a work of literature in terms of
Well,
how narrative it's focused.
yeah, well, it does come from
Right,
literature, of course.
right,
Um, but you mean it has a kind of a narrative trajectory
definitely.
in the way that a fictional story would have.
Definitely.
Um,
And you can almost see the different kind of chapters or parts of a work of literature as you're watching it. And you even have often breaks for intermission, or, in between the acts, or, it's just like a play essentially, even in the dance form.
yes, it can very much be part of, be seen that way. And here we're talking, of course, of performative arts. I mean,
Right,
dance need not necessarily be performative at all.
right.
So, and
Oh,
secondly,
definitely.
to go back to your idea about Nutcracker and the storytelling of the Casse-Noisette, you could also argue that there's always a tension in dance between that narrative idea, the fact that a gesture in space and time is always narrative by virtue of being a gesture
Mm,
physically in space and time. But at the same time, it has a very abstract kind of feel about it. So you get things like the pas de deux in the Nutcracker, or you get individual divertissement, where you can just, or the corps de ballet work. Actually, Swan Lake is a good example of that, where you see the corps de ballet in Act 2 of Swan Lake as a single body. It's extraordinarily abstract, even if
definitely.
it has mimetic elements in it, like the flapping of the arms,
Yeah,
but the actual patterning and and kind of visual appearance of a chorus on stage, actually it goes back it relates somewhat to some of the things we might talk about in Nietzsche, you know, in the idea of the chorus and so on. But there again, you have this tension between the narrative and the abstract that comes out quite a lot in dance. And I think sometimes it worries intellectuals because they don't know how to write about it. I think that's one of the big problems, is that intellectuals like to have a really good experience of what they're writing about. And if they don't, if they've never done dance or haven't seen much dance, they tend not to quite know how to approach it. I mean, there are many exceptions to this, to this rule I'm making, but you know, that's one of the reasons I think that it gets, the dance tends to get marginalized in the academy anyway. The other reason, of course, is that it does tend to suffer from the fact that it doesn't have many recordings. Dance notation isn't recorded in the same way that musical notation has been recorded for years and years and years. Although there have been lots of different forms of notation, they haven't always survived until the 20th century.
I was just thinking when you were speaking about the fluttering of the wings in Swan Lake, there seems to be this kind of suspension of disbelief that occurs in dance that you have to a lesser extent in literature. I mean, in literature, obviously, your brain is aware that you are reading words on a piece of paper and you have to imagine everything. But, you know, if someone says there's a duck or a swan on the page, then there is, you know what I mean? Then there is a swan on the page. And literature kind of tells you exactly what it is, and your mind does the world building. But because it's all happening inside of your mind, I guess. But with dance, you actually have images and people and scenes unfolding in front of your eyes, not in your head often, in terms of performative dance like ballet. And so when you have, you know, humans fluttering their arms like swans, you have to understand that these are swans, actually, you know, just as in a piece of dramatic literature or, you know, prose, if it says the swans appeared, you would say, right, the swans have appeared now. But when you're watching a piece of dance, you actually have to also get yourself there, however that works.
I think that's a really interesting point to take up there, because of course it's not true of all literature. You know, not all literature is realist in that way, that it's making it easy for the reader to imagine what's in front of them. I was thinking of somebody like W.B. Yeats, you know, and his image of the Leda and the Swan. You know, I mean, what's that all about? You know, how does he make you imagine it? I mean, Yeats is an interesting example because in an essay on Edmund Spenser, he was talking about the distinctions between allegory and symbol. And he said he didn't like allegory. He much preferred symbol because of its wizard frenzy. I just think that's such a wonderful phrase. And it reminds me of the flapping of wings in Swan Lake Act 2. There's a kind of conjuring of realism, of a real swan, but in a totally different symbolic form, you know, that's not pinned down. It's an imaginative act that has to take place between the audience and, in the case of Swan Lake, the audience and what is visualized or presented on stage. Yeah, I think that's really a difficult, and that's a difficult question to deal with in the idea when we're talking about dance, because if we go back to the original question about intellectual versus body, well, how does dance kind of present itself as a thing in itself, you know, in the way that music is, or art is? Nobody questions that art or music have their own aesthetics, their own aesthetic principles that that really pertain to their particular art form. but somehow dance has to explain itself. And I think that's been a big problem. And the dance scholarship now is really tackling that. I mean, when I wrote that book in 2013 about modernism and dance, the
Yes.
things have moved on
Yes,
so
yes.
much from there. And a lot of dance departments, a lot of dance scholars are really tackling this issue of what constitutes dance itself as a, you know, as of itself. So
Definitely.
that's a big
Definitely.
problem. Yeah.
I would love to turn to your book. So you have an amazing book published in 2013 entitled Literature, Modernism, and Dance, which, quote, investigates dance's impact on the modernist critique of language and shows the importance to writers of choreographic innovations by dancers of the fin de siècle. So in this introductory chapter, you give a brilliant account of the exchange that is occurring between literary and dance figures, from Jean Cocteau's involvement with ballets to Nietzsche's contributions to modern dance during this period. And you write, quote, the exchange was extensive, yet dance has only recently gained recognition in studies of literary modernism. Music, painting, architecture, and film have received major attention, whereas the contribution of dance is frequently reserved for specialist accounts. So, why do you think the significance of dance in the role of literature and culture more widely has been overlooked for so long, particularly during this period? Why have the relationships between literature and other art forms taken precedence or dominated the critical conversation as of late?
Well, I think it is partly because of what we've already said about the fact that that dance for many years has only really recently been recorded formally in notation. You know, there's Benesch and Laban notation this century, but it goes back much further. I mean, there's Stepanov notation, the 19th century, various forms of individual notation, but they haven't carried through. And there's also the problem of dance being so ephemeral. It can only be really recorded on video, you know, because it requires this visual element, musical element. I mean, not necessarily music. I mean, you've got plenty of dances in silence, and we can talk about silence in another question, because I think that's a big issue as well. But but I think that is true. It's been very slow to be picked up in relation, you know, to literature, whereas modernism and film, modernism and architecture and so on have had many accounts.
Definitely.
I mean, somebody who really did that, alas, she's passed away now, but who really looked at that relationship was Laura Marcus in her book on rhythm, which has been published posthumously. But she was working on the issue of rhythm when she came to work in Oxford, and we talked a lot about the importance of dance at this period, because she was very much a distinguished literary modernist. And
Yeah.
you're absolutely right that it's only really now being looked at, you know, in relation to literature as a major discipline. There's also the problem of the fact that, you know, dance has to some extent now, after having flourished in the 60s and 70s in universities like University of Roehampton, for example, which has a wonderful dance department. All these dance departments are being cut in the academy. And this is actually a very important moment because of the cutting or merging of dance departments into departments of performing arts and so on, which is fine because, you know, we're now really interested in movement, you know, as an expansion of dance.
Right.
And but and early 20th century modernists were responsible for that. You know, someone like Bronislava Nijinská, the great choreographer of the 20th century, brother of Václav Nijinsky. She made a ballet called Les Noces, which is perhaps one of the most important. I don't know if you've seen it. Have you seen Les
I
Noces?
haven't seen it, but I've heard of it.
Yeah, and you can get clips of it on video and so on. But it's really one of the most important modernist choreographies of the 20th
Yeah.
century. And, you know, she thought very theoretically about dance. She called her school in Kiev. She went to stay in Kiev in 1917 during, you know, post-revolution and all of that stuff. She was a great friend of Alexandra Exter, the artist, modernist artist, constructivist artist. And Nijinská is somebody who set up her École de Mouvement, school of movement. She moved from the idea of dance as a very kind of limited, small thing in the corner to movement as something that applies to all forms of life, really. So that you could argue in a way that choreography can be a form of life in some way. You know, that so much of life is choreographed. It's not always stylized, you know, like walking along the road, but it's still an important choreographic activity.
I love that idea. That's really fascinating because I think so much of our lives are choreographed in a way, you know, shaking someone's hand or waving or greeting them in that way. Those
Exactly.
are physical choreographic movements, like for sure.
Exactly. And I think a dramatist who's particularly interested in that kind of side of things is Samuel Beckett.
Mm,
We don't often think of him as a choreographer, but actually I'm trying to write a book on Beckett as a choreographer
I
right
saw,
now.
yeah,
But his, you know, he loved to walk, he loved cricket, you know, he was a physical person. And if we look at the plays in great detail, but not only the plays, the prose as well, we find just how much interest there is in a kind of stylization or of movement. And it's not stylization as such, it's more about attention to rhythm, pace, and time within the space, within the stage space. So you
definitely.
will find that his stage directions are really, really brutal. You know, he doesn't like, he said in his, his estate will tell you that, you know, you can't change any of those directions, you know.
Right.
But he was interested in the kind of quotidian movement, the ordinary movement of everyday people, as much as dancing. I mean, he hated ballet, and except for Petrushka. He liked the ballet Petrushka because he thought it worked as philosophy, but
Interesting.
which is interesting. But he hated all the frills and furbelows of ballet. You know, he is a minimalist and always economizing on form. But he
Def-
does that in relation to movement. So stillness is incredibly important for Beckett. You know,
Definitely. I can't
even
wait to read that book that you are
oh,
writing.
me
So
too. I can't wait to finish it. But oh my goodness, it's a tough one. You know.
no,
Um,
definitely. I would love to chat a bit about the kind of figure of the dancer that you
oh
touch
yeah,
on in your 2013 book.
yeah.
And so you have this amazing quote. So in the book, I think it's also in the introduction or potentially in one of the later chapters, you have an amazing quote where you write, quote, "In this climate of anxiety about language, the figure of the dancer emerged as a provocative and suggestive emblem." So I love the way that you've said this because it's really drawing on these two strands of language being criticized or broken down or even just looked at more heavily. And you have this largely nonverbal art form then
Yeah.
emerging as a way to potentially deconstruct language even further. So I'd love to hear you expand on this idea, which is absolutely fascinating. And I want to ask kind of, what would you say that would you say rather that the modernists push away from linear language or linear narrative was in fact what led to the beginning of a relationship between dance and literature, or a stronger relationship? Is a rejection of language underlying all this, or a move towards the physically expressive from the verbally expressive, kind of the bottom line of why this is all coming together at once?
Well, I think it is to some extent. Certainly, there is a kind of skepticism about language. It's largely a skepticism, the fact that people are withdrawing their judgment. Like so many of the modernist writers. You could think about, I suppose, philosophers like Bergson, who's interested in the flow of time and space, that kind of thing. But I don't think it is altogether a total kind of rejection of language per se, because I mean, you can, as we've said already, in some ways, it sounds very metaphorical, but you can talk about the grammar of dance. You can actually think about the way in which different forms of dance, show a kind of grammar, show a kind of codification of particular ways of doing things. But I think it is true that at the beginning of the 20th century, certainly, there's this great push for seeing the dancer as an expressivist figure who moves beyond language, or can stand in place of language because they can express the unspoken. There's a whole kind of modernist interest in the unsaid and the unheard. So, while Joyce is absolutely, a master of language and of linguistic games and all forms of linguistic representation, he's nevertheless, interested in other forms that might take language's place, or might express what most people are thinking of as a kind of a hiatus, a gap in language. That moment. I'm going to have to go back to Conrad because I know him better. There's a moment in Lord Jim where Jim has jumped ship, and betrayed his crew by jumping ship. And he expresses it as, I had jumped, it seems, ... So there's a kind of cognitive dissonance. There's a gap in his cognitive trajectory where he can't remember actually jumping because it's too traumatic, and the ... dots, always look out for them in modernist texts because they usually mean some form of traumatic or hyper difficult, inexpressible moment. So yes, I think you're right that certainly dance starts to be taken seriously by modernist writers because it does appear to stand in for what cannot be expressed. I mean, there's a moment in Joyce about Salome's dance, which is an inexpressible thing. Yeah. So
Yeah,
I would agree with you there to some extent. But on the other hand, I think there's also
it has its own language in a way.
a new interest in its own language
Definitely.
and in its own aesthetic relations,
Definitely.
grammatical aspects.
particularly in, dances like ballet, where there really is that underlying narrative structure, and it's not just whatever you feel, but there actually is something content wise that's attempted to, be communicated to the viewer.
Well, exactly, because there's a technique. I mean,
Right.
there's also
Right.
the issue of discipline and technique. And
Right.
you know, ballet, of course, has a very sophisticated and complex
Very much.
technique. Everybody has to learn the names of the steps, and and it is a compilation of phrases. In a way, there are many, many phrases compiled of different steps in dance that's very learned.
Yeah.
Interestingly, it's just made me think of the fact that T.S. Eliot actually wrote in some of his essays on drama. He alluded to the fact that ballet, and he was very keen on the Ballet Russe. He'd been to see Leonid Massine dancing in 1919 in the Ballet Russe. He was very interested in the idea that ballet would be the drama of the future. Now, I think that's fascinating. Why did he felt that there was something new and innovative at that moment in time about the way dances are put together in a dramatic context. And, it's referred to in all sorts of ways. I'm thinking of something like the tarantella in A Doll's House, proto-modernists are actually thinking about how the dancer might come in to say something that's not expressible in language. So it's all bound up with that very
No, definitely.
that you made. Yeah.
I think it's fascinating that dance, in a way, can be gesturing to something, before language or non-language or
Yes.
non-verbal, but it also is at the same time building up its own language. So it's at once a rejection of language and also a creation of its own language in a strange way, which is really, really interesting.
Yes. And it always has been. I mean, I think we tend to dismiss the history of dance as
Yeah.
if, dance just was there.
Started in ballet. Yeah. Yeah.
As a ballet. But of course, I mean, some of the, if we're looking now to, for example, trying to decolonize the curriculum, we need to take much more account, and people are doing this. There are a lot of very, very good dance scholars who are doing this, but we need to think about, very much earlier forms of dance than 17th century French political dance. Basically, I mean, it was the Sun King who created this as a way of showing that he was the authority over everything.
Yeah.
But there are many, many forms. I mean, I remember going to see a lot of Pueblo Indian dances in New Mexico and being totally struck by the fact that they could not give a monkey's toss about whether there was an audience there or not. This is a dance that has been ritualized for centuries and centuries, and is really focused on the community and on an inward gaze. So you almost feel uncomfortable if you're looking at it, I mean, and D.H. Lawrence wrote a bit about that, although he's not perhaps the best example.
That's really interesting. Well, speaking of more ancient or earlier forms of dance, you write an amazing chapter for the book, The Ancient Dancer in the Modern World, published in 2010. And your chapter is entitled Modernism and Dance, Apolline or Dionysiac. And you have a brilliant quote in which you write, quote, Nietzsche's influence on modernist literature and music is well documented, but he introduces a space for dance, suggesting an authority that exists outside language and that is rooted in the body rather than in the intellect. And you continue saying that there is a, quote, Nietzschean interest in the primitive and a search for an original unity in forms of dance from this time, which I think is beautifully put. I think these words that you're pulling out are really fascinating, especially this idea of an original unity that's rooted in the body, that's pre-language or nonverbal. It really makes me think of this notion of dance as something that's fundamental or prelapsarian in a way. Um, because it's nonverbal, because it's rooted in the body, because it's pre-intellect, because it's ancient. And so I don't know, I love this idea, and I would love to hear a bit about your thoughts, a bit more about this kind of primal aspect to dance, like an art form that can exist before language, like exist before order, before society, before civilization. I think that's such a beautiful idea, and I'd love to, yeah.
Well, you need to read some classicists on this on this topic. But Nietzsche's idea basically was he was really talking, and he was talking about this prelapsarian energy, the Dionysiac, Dionysus being god of wine and
Right.
drinking, having a great time. But it really comes from the chthonic, what is in Greek known as the chthonic, or from the earth. This is like an energy that comes from the earth. And yes, I think this was a absolutely major find for Nietzsche, because he was a classicist himself, but he reread the classics in the light of thinking about the Apolline against the Dionysiac. But what is and you talk about an original unity. What I think is interesting about Nietzsche is that actually, if you go on and I'm thinking about the Nietzsche of The Birth of Tragedy, and if you get to the end of that, he really talks about, that in the end we worship at the altars of both gods, Apollo and Dionysus, that there is an amalgamation. So he's really talking about the history of representation in Western European art generally, so that the Apolline would be, the painterly frame, the representation of this, but chthonic or earthly energy that comes from Dionysus. But there's a combination. He wants to put the two together at the end. And that's what he feels has been lost in Western art, that we have lost that primeval urge, as it were. I think that's a gloss of what he's saying.
No,
I mean,
definitely. Yeah.
And I think that's it's always worth bearing in mind, the fact that, of course, Nietzsche is there talking about forms of dance that relate possibly to the chorus in Greek tragedy.
Yeah.
But he's thinking about the way the chthonic is really encompassed by the choral getting together. There's a kind of choral subjectivity, which you could also argue exists in the corps de ballet. Okay, so you see how he's really talking about the kind of essence of what dance is. You're either going to do dances on your own, or you're going to do dances together. And there's a kind of group subjectivity.
Yes, I love that.
That is really, it really happens when you get, when you get a lot of people dancing together, and it has an extraordinary dramatic effect. And it's about losing one's individual identity, which seems in a way counterintuitive if you think about it in relation to modernism, because modernism seems to be all about the individual creation of subjectivity. And I think you would probably want to talk about that, in relation to Freud and Lacan and so on, and this kind of.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how this idea of dance as nonverbal or, primal or original or prelapsarian, it really calls back to what Freud and Lacan think about when they kind of describe the
Yeah.
entrance into language as constituting the
Yes.
entrance into subjecthood.
Absolutely.
Because we're not in language, we're not in subjecthood. We're in this like Christevan semiotic realm, this nonverbal realm of children, essentially,
Yeah.
or pre even being in the womb, like some other spiritual realm.
Yeah.
Um,
And
just
Kristeva talks about that too, doesn't? Well, in a different way. Yeah. She kind
yeah,
of privileges the
yeah,
semiotic.
exactly. And I find
So
that I
I
just
think, yeah, so I think there is that argument about dance that it often belongs to the semiotic. But don't forget, if you put dance on a stage, it's
definitely.
already become Apolline.
That is true, because I feel like there are so many different types of dance, and it's really interesting how
Yes.
we're drawing out these two different threads in our conversation of what happens to dance when it becomes actually very ingrained in societal culture and very stylized and very, as you were saying, it has its own language and notation, and we have teachers, this is how you do it. Then it's moving away from this notion of I feel it, so I communicate it in this
Yes.
spiritual nonverbal way. It's actually, but then on the other hand, you have a group subjectivity coming together, which is quite magical in its own way. So there are a
Absolutely.
lot of different things happening.
There are. And I mean, I think a great example of that is actually Martha Graham. If you look back at Martha Graham's her kind of choreographic journey. I mean, I only learned recently that Martha Graham went to India and learned an enormous amount from Indian classical dance and Indian spirituality. So, I mean, of course, that all sounds like, looking at the other and appropriating the other into Western modernism. But she's an example of somebody who tries to reach this really seductive element of primal energy in many
Yeah,
of us. Yeah,
moving away from the overly stylized European kind of conception. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah,
that's really
absolutely.
interesting.
Yeah,
Really interesting.
yeah.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. I have massively enjoyed our conversation, and I'm sure everyone listening has too. In terms of a closing question, I do have one closing question for you,
Yes.
which is, do you have any advice for young scholars, young academics, maybe just starting their PhD thesis or anything similar, beginning to embark on this journey of researching the relationship between dance and literature, or potentially a journey into literary modernism? But I would love to hear specifically your advice on people who want to research dance and literature, because I think that's such an understudied, as you're saying, subject. So yeah, I'm sure anyone who is, looking to study this would massively appreciate it.
Well, first and foremost, thank you very much, Daphne, for your questions. And
Of
thank you
course.
for the last question. I think go with your heart is my first thing.
I love
What
that.
area of dance really interests you? And then think, I mean, I would say go with dance first and then think about, how it relates to literary productions at that time. I mean, you may want to go and research. I have a very good friend who's researched Shakespeare and dance. And she's just written a book on it. And she went with an area of literature that really interests her, but she kind of started from the idea of literary ballets. So you
There you
could
go.
do it from that way. But there are also, there are people you could read like Mark Franco, Lynn Garafola, and a dance historian who's written on the Ballets Russes. And that's a good place to start if you want to talk about modernism. Laura Marcus, definitely on film. She's got a book out. She had a book out, or she has now, the 10th Muse on film and modernism. And now she has passed away, sadly. But her latest work, her final work on rhythm, is also available in shops.
Right.
And there are many dance scholars writing on literature and dance now, Lucia Ruprecht from Berlin and all over the world. So I would say go and read some books with literature in the title, dance in the title, because, you know, there's a lot of work out there, so that you can immerse yourself in the potential or the possibilities of the reciprocal relationship. And I'm really emphasizing the reciprocal relationship rather than saying, well, this fictional text was used as the basis for a ballet. Well, that doesn't tell you very much. We want to find out why the choreographer used that particular text.
The exchange, as you were saying in your own book, the exchange.
Or vice versa, you know.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay,
well,
then.
I so appreciate it. I hope you have an amazing rest of your day. And I really enjoyed this conversation. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it too, Daphne. Thank you.